You ever hear a song that stops you in your tracks? A song that makes you feel like somebody out there has lived through the same heartbreak, the same longing, the same loneliness you've carried inside? For millions of people, that voice was Roy Orbison, the man in black hidden behind those dark glasses, with a voice that could cut through your soul. People thought they knew him cool, mysterious, untouchable. But the real story? The truth about Roy Orbison's life is one of the most heartbreaking, astonishing, and inspiring tales in music history. Because behind that elegant voice and quiet smile was a man who endured more tragedy than most could bear, and yet, instead of being destroyed by it, he turned it into timeless art. Tonight, we're diving deep into the life of Roy Orbison, the heartbreaks, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the moments that made him one of the most unforgettable legends in music. Childhood beginnings. Roy Kelton Orbison was born on April 23, 1936, in Vernon, Texas. He wasn't born into wealth or fame. He came into the world in the middle of the Great Depression. His dad, Orby Lee, was an oil field worker and sometimes mechanic. His mom, Nadine, loved to paint and write poetry, and that creative spark definitely left its mark on him. Roy wasn't the healthiest child. From a young age, he struggled with poor eyesight. At just 4 years old, he was already wearing thick glasses that made him stand out from the other kids. You can imagine how that felt, being the shy boy with Coke bottle lenses in a rough Texas town where toughness and football were everything. But instead of fighting to fit in, Roy found something else to lean on, something that made people notice him in a different way. For his 6th birthday, his father gave him a guitar. It wasn't much, but in Roy's hands it became magic. By 7, he was strumming along with his dad and brother. By 8, he was singing on the radio. By 9, he won a contest and landed his own radio show. Just picture that. A little boy with big glasses standing in front of a microphone in a tiny Texas station, pouring his heart into songs while neighbors tuned in on crackling radios. When his family moved to Wink, Texas in 1946, Roy found himself in a town that revolved around oil and football. Roy didn't care for either. He was shy, sensitive, and more interested in chords than touchdowns. He dyed his blonde hair black to look a little tougher, but his real strength was in music. At 13, he formed his first band, the Wink Westerners. They weren't just playing country, they dabbled in swing, rock, even some jazz. They got radio time and even appeared on local TV. Roy was hooked. Breaking into music after high school, Roy tried to be practical. He enrolled in North Texas State College to study geology. Oil money was steady money, and geology seemed safer than chasing dreams. But sitting through lectures while music burned inside him, it didn't last. He dropped out and threw himself into his band, now called the Teen Kings. In 1956, they recorded Ooby Dooby, a fun little rockabilly number. Sun Records picked it up, the same label that made Elvis, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis household names. Suddenly, Roy was standing in the same spotlight as the biggest stars of the era. Ooby Dooby sold nearly 200,000 copies. For a kid from Wink, that was life-changing, but success didn't stick. The follow-ups flopped, the band split. By the end of the year, Roy was on his own, broke and disillusioned. That could have been the end of his story, but Roy had something the others didn't, a gift for songwriting. He signed with Cuff Rose Music, writing songs for other artists. That's where he met Joe Melson. Together, they crafted something unique, songs that weren't about cars and parties, but about heartbreak, loneliness, longing. Roy wasn't afraid of sadness. He leaned into it. His ballads were operatic, dramatic, and emotional, in a way nobody else was doing. And when he sang them, that's when everything changed. The rise of the voice. By the early 60s, Roy Orbison was everywhere. Only the Lonely, Running Scared, Crying, In Dreams. Song after song climbed the charts. His voice was unlike anything people had heard. He could start low and tender, then leap into a falsetto so powerful it gave you chills. Elvis himself called Roy the greatest singer in the world. On stage, he was different from the other stars. No wild hip shakes like Elvis. No Mick Jagger strut. Roy stood almost still, dressed in black, hidden behind those dark shades, and let the music do the talking. And audiences? They were mesmerized. The Beatles admitted that touring with him was terrifying because no one wanted to go on after Roy Orbison. He seemed unstoppable. But behind the fame, trouble was brewing. Love, betrayal, and heartbreak. Roy had married Claudette Frady, a stunning young woman who became both his love and his muse. She was the pretty woman in his most famous song. To fans, they looked like a dream couple, the shy star and his beautiful wife. But life behind closed doors was far messier. Roy was on the road constantly, gone for weeks at a time. He wasn't always faithful, and Claudette, feeling lonely and abandoned, began an affair with Braxton Dixon, the contractor building their new home. For Roy, it was a brutal betrayal. In 1965, they divorced. Fans were heartbroken, but fate had other plans. That same year, Claudette gave birth to their third son. The joy of raising another child brought them back together. By December, they had remarried. It seemed like redemption, a second chance at love. But tragedy was just around the corner. The accident. On June 6, 1966, Roy and Claudette were riding their motorcycles in Tennessee. They loved riding, it was a thrill they shared. But that day, as they cruised down the road, a pickup truck pulled out in front of Claudette. The crash was violent. She was thrown from her bike, rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. Claudette was gone. She was just 25. For Roy, it was shattering. His wife, his muse, the woman who had inspired his greatest song, gone in an instant. His grief seeped into his music, making his already emotional songs even heavier, even more heartbreaking. And then, just 2 years later, another tragedy struck. The house fire. In 1968, while Roy was on tour in England, his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, caught fire. Inside were his two eldest sons, Roy Jr. and Anthony. The fire spread quickly. Despite desperate attempts to save them, both boys died. Can you imagine that? Losing your wife, then losing two of your children, back to back within 2 years. Friends said Roy went quiet, withdrawn. For a while, he couldn't even bring himself to write music. The man who sang the world's heartbreak now carried more pain than anyone could put into words. Johnny Cash later bought that very house. Strangely, years later, it too burned down. A tragic coincidence tied to the same patch of land. Finding love again. Even through grief, life has a way of pulling us forward. In London, Roy met Barbara Velhonen, a young German woman. She was lively, supportive, and brought light back into his world. They married in 1969. Together they had two more sons, Roy Jr. and Alexander. His youngest child with Claudette, Wesley, was raised by Roy's parents, giving him stability while Roy toured. Barbara became not just his wife, but the protector of his legacy. She would later dedicate her life to making sure Roy Orbison's music never faded. Decline and struggles. But while Roy's personal life began to stabilize, his career hit a rough patch. The late 60s and 70s were dominated by psychedelic rock, protest music, and heavier sounds. Roy's dramatic ballads suddenly felt old-fashioned. His albums barely sold. His one attempt at a movie, The Fastest Guitar Alive, where he played a spy with a guitar that shot bullets, was a flop so bad the rest of his film deal was canceled. For a while, Roy Orbison, the man with the most haunting voice in rock, faded from the spotlight. The comeback. But legends don't stay buried forever. In the 1980s, Roy began a slow, powerful comeback. His songs were rediscovered by new fans. David Lynch used In Dreams in his cult film Blue Velvet, reminding people just how chillingly beautiful Roy's voice was. Then came something even bigger, the Traveling Wilburys. Imagine this lineup: George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and Roy Orbison, a supergroup of legends. Their debut album in 1988 was a smash hit, winning Grammys and topping charts. And Roy, he was finally recognized again as the giant he always was. At the same time, he was recording his own album, Mystery Girl, produced by Jeff Lynne with songs co-written by Tom Petty. It was pure Orbison, dramatic, emotional, unforgettable. The single, You Got It, shot up the charts, becoming one of his biggest hits ever. It seemed like everything was finally coming together. Roy Orbison was back, the sudden end. But then, just as quickly, it was over. On December 6, 1988, just 2 days after performing in Ohio, Roy Orbison suffered a fatal heart attack while visiting his mother in Tennessee. He was only 52. The world was stunned. Here was a man whose career had been reborn, whose voice was once again filling stadiums, and he was gone. But in death, his career soared. Mystery Girl was released weeks later and became the best-selling album of his life. He became the first artist since Elvis to have 2 albums in the U.S. top 5 after death. The music video for End of the Line, released by the Wilburys after his passing, honored him in the simplest, most beautiful way: a rocking chair holding his guitar with a framed picture of him beside it. The sunglasses. And what about those famous dark glasses? They weren't part of some carefully crafted image. Roy had terrible eyesight. Before a tour with the Beatles in 1963, he forgot his regular glasses on a plane. The only spares he had were prescription sunglasses. He wore them on stage, photographers snapped pictures, and fans thought it was the coolest look ever. From that moment on, the shades weren't just practical, they were iconic. The man in black, mysterious behind his glasses, became one of the most recognizable figures in music. Legacy Roy Orbison's story is more than just the tale of a rock star. It's the story of resilience, of a man who endured tragedies that would have crushed most people, but still stood up and sang. His songs weren't just hits, they were raw emotion. When you hear Crying, you can feel the weight of his grief. When you hear Only the Lonely, you know he lived that loneliness. His music was powerful because it was real. Even decades later, his influence is everywhere. Younger artists cite him as inspiration. His songs keep finding new life in films, commercials, streaming playlists. And thanks to Barbara, and later his sons, his legacy has been protected, celebrated, and kept alive for new generations. Roy Orbison wasn't just a voice, he was a storyteller, a man who turned heartbreak into beauty, a man who lived through the worst life could throw at him and still gave the world music that heals. So the next time you hear his soaring falsetto, remember, it isn't just music, it's survival, it's resilience, it's truth. And that's why Roy Orbison will never be forgotten. When they divorced in 1965, fans were shocked. To them, Roy and Claudette were proof that true love existed. Seeing them split felt like the shattering of an illusion. But just months later, they were back together. And when they remarried, it seemed like a fairy tale ending, love conquering all. That's what made her death in 1966 so unbearably cruel. To lose her just when they had found each other again, it was tragedy with a twist of irony so sharp it almost felt scripted. And the fire in 1968, when his 2 sons perished, pushed that tragedy into the unthinkable. Friends said Roy walked around like a ghost after that. He would go through the motions, but his spark dimmed. Music had always been his refuge, but for a while, even that abandoned him. Imagine walking onto a stage to sing Crying after losing your wife and children. Those weren't just lyrics anymore, they were echoes of his life. Still, there were moments of light. Meeting Barbara gave him stability and a chance at rebuilding a family. She wasn't just his partner, she became the guardian of his story, fiercely protecting his legacy long after his death. Without Barbara, Roy's music might not have stayed as alive as it is today. Now let's zoom out to the bigger picture, the music world of the 1970s. Roy's sound, those lush ballads with orchestral arrangements, suddenly seemed out of place. Audiences wanted psychedelic rock, protest anthems, hard guitars. Roy's voice was still incredible, but the industry had moved on. His records barely sold. Critics called him outdated. For years, he was almost invisible, but true artistry never really disappears. In the 1980s, Roy's music began creeping back. Younger artists revered him. Bruce Springsteen once said he wished he could write songs like Orbison. Bono of U2 called him one of the greatest singers who ever lived. David Lynch put In Dreams in Blue Velvet, and suddenly a new generation discovered the eerie power of his voice. And then came the miracle of the Traveling Wilburys. Think about this: George Harrison, fresh out of the Beatles, Bob Dylan, the poet of his generation, Tom Petty, the rock star of the moment, Jeff Lynne, the producer genius behind ELO, and Roy Orbison, the man who had once been forgotten. Together, they created something magical. Their album didn't just succeed, it soared. And Roy, after decades of struggle, was back on top. His solo project, Mystery Girl, was icing on the cake. Songs like You Got It reminded everyone that Roy wasn't just a voice from the past. He was timeless. Just weeks after his death, the album exploded, becoming the best-selling of his career. And maybe that's part of what makes his story so haunting. Just as he was reclaiming his throne, just as the world was remembering his greatness, he was taken away at only 52. But his legacy? It only grew. After his death, his catalog surged. He became the first artist since Elvis to have 2 albums in the U.S., top 5 posthumously. His songs showed up in movies, commercials, cover albums, and thanks to Barbara and later his sons, his estate continued to release rare recordings and keep his music alive. And here's the thing: Roy Orbison's songs still resonate because the emotions behind them are eternal. Heartbreak doesn't go out of style. Loneliness doesn't age. When you hear Crying Today, it doesn't sound like a song from the 1960s. It sounds like someone pouring their heart out right now. That's the kind of timelessness very few artists ever achieve. If you enjoyed diving into his story with me, do me a favor, hit that like button. It really helps us keep making these deep dives. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another journey into the lives of music's greatest legends. Thanks for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.